Hey, is that your grandma out here to knit us sweaters? Nah, bro. She's probably looking for the bingo hall. Laughter rippled down the line. A few mimicked a limp. One even pretended to nap. She just looked at them once. Calm, measured. You think silence means weakness, she said softly, but silence is how you aim. The wind was howling across the range. Dust swirled like ghosts. 5 moving targets appeared in the distance. One by one, the best recruits missed. Then she stepped forward. No high-tech scope, no partner, just an old rifle and older hands. She didn't blink. 5 shots, 5 hits. The range went silent. Not a word was spoken. But everything had changed. Fort Archer didn't whisper. It roared. The kind of place where dust never settled and neither did pride. By Euro 7:30, the sun already burned down with desert vengeance, baking the gravel underfoot and painting sweat into the collars of every recruit on the range. The place smelled like gun oil, sunscreen, and the kind of anxiety only a live fire test could stir up. The new recruits stood lined up near the firing line, all clean uniforms and cocky smiles. Most of them were still riding high on adrenaline from morning drills. Some cracked jokes. Others adjusted their optics like pros, though half still fumbled with their gear when no one was watching. To them, this day was a proving ground, and they were ready to prove everything. Then the van pulled up. It wasn't marked. Just a faded military transport with creaking suspension. The door slid open with a dry groan, and out stepped a woman. Slowly, deliberately. She looked completely out of place, a cane in one hand, a canvas rifle case slung over her back. Her khakis were plain, her windbreaker faded at the shoulders. Her cap held no rank, no insignia, just a stitched name tag Kane. Her silver hair was tucked beneath the brim, but the sun lit up every line on her face. There was a slight limp in her step, not weakness, just memory carved into muscle. At first, the recruits thought it was a mistake. Uh, ma'am, you lost, one of them called out. Another elbowed his friend. She here to do a guest lecture on flintlocks that broke the dam. Maybe she brought snacks, someone chuckled. Grandma's here to knit us all sniper socks. No way she's qualifying. She's probably here for the bingo tent. The laughter spread quickly, most of it nervous, some of it cruel, but none of it quiet. She didn't respond. She kept walking slow, sure straight toward the registration tent, like the heat didn't touch her, and the voices were just wind. From the observation tower, Staff Sergeant Reynolds narrowed his eyes. She wasn't on his radar? Not really. The name had come through processing last week, Margaret Kane, retired, special authorization. But standing there now, watching her walk past a dozen snickering kids who didn't know better, something about her posture made him pause. It wasn't pride, it wasn't defiance, it was purpose. She didn't look at anyone, didn't ask for a partner, didn't even glance at the line of rifles gleaming in the morning sun. She just kept walking, and Fort Archer, for all its noise and bluster, didn't know it yet. But something had just entered the range that couldn't be measured in rank or years. It was legacy wrapped in dust and silence. By the time Margaret Kane reached the edge of the rifle range, the sun was merciless, baking the metal benches and casting sharp shadows beneath the awnings. A few of the recruits had found shade, but most lingered near the gear station, adjusting their slings, checking scopes, or just trying to look like they knew what they were doing. That's when they really got a good look at her. Her rifle case slung across her back was clearly older than anyone present. The faded olive canvas, the scuffed leather trim, the rust-kissed zippers, it was more relic than regulation. Her windbreaker had seen better decades. Her boots were worn almost soft from age. No tactical gear, no tech, no patches. Just a cane and a presence. One recruit leaned toward another, suppressing a laugh. Is that even standard issue? Looks like it came out of World War II. She probably still calls them krauts, someone whispered. I bet her rifle fires musket balls. The laughter spread again, quieter this time, but sharper, more cutting. Margaret said nothing. She moved to the end of the line where the benches met the sand. Slowly, she lowered herself to one knee, then unfolded her mat with the precision of someone who had done it 1,000 times before. She opened her rifle case. A gasp, then another chuckle. The bolt-action rifle inside was spotless, but undeniably old. The stock was a rich, weathered walnut, A name carved faintly into the side, Kane M. No bipod, no digital readout, just iron and discipline. Seriously, that's what she's using, a young corporal with mirrored sunglasses scoffed. Might as well throw rocks. A female recruit nearby muttered under her breath. Someone's grandma came to cosplay. Up in the observation post, Staff Sergeant Reynolds stood with arms crossed, squinting into the glare. He said nothing, but his brow creased as he watched her work. He had reviewed her file, at least part of it, but even on paper, Margaret Kane felt like a ghost from a forgotten war. There was something about her calm, her quiet. She wasn't rattled, wasn't pretending. She simply moved focused, like none of the noise existed. Then came the pairing order. Recruits would spot for each other during win and distance drills. The list was read out fast, last names, quick groupings. When they reached Kane's name, there was a pause. No one volunteered. One recruit took a half step back. Another glanced down, suddenly very interested in tying his boot. The silence grew awkward. She can just go solo, someone muttered. Reynolds said nothing. He made a note on his clipboard, then looked down at the woman kneeling quietly at the far end. Margaret didn't ask for a partner, didn't flinch. She simply pulled a pencil from her pocket, opened a small leather notebook, and began calculating her own corrections by hand. And while they whispered, she just waited for the win, for the silence, for the shot that would come. The first round was meant to be a warm-up, 100-yard static targets, light wind, nothing complicated. Easy enough to weed out those who were all talk. The recruits lined up in pairs, rifles loaded, spotters crouched beside them with binoculars and notepads. Jokes still floated down the line like dust, but the energy had shifted. Margaret Kane was the only one without a spotter. No one offered. No one dared. She knelt alone at the far end of the line, her old rifle resting steady on her folded mat. Her breath, even her face, expressionless. She wasn't fumbling, wasn't second-guessing, just preparing. A few of the younger recruits kept glancing sideways at her as if expecting her to misfire or worse fail in some embarrassing slow-motion way they could laugh about over dinner. "Watch," this one said with a smirk. "She's going to miss the whole target board." But then came the crack of her first shot. Not rushed, not timid, just sharp, clean, and perfectly timed between gusts of wind. The spotter nearest her stopped mid-chew on a stick of gum. He lowered his binoculars slowly. "Dead center," he muttered. "Tight grouping." A couple heads turned. Margaret calmly cycled the bolt, caught the shell mid-air, and placed it beside her. Then she fired again. Ping. Another center strike. She didn't adjust much. Just a subtle twitch of the scope, a breath in, a breath out. Third shot. Ping. Spotters started murmuring. One even nudged his partner and pointed. "You seeing this?" The laughter from earlier had evaporated. In its place, a creeping discomfort. The kind of discomfort that grows when reality starts to bend the story you've been telling yourself. This wasn't luck. It wasn't some fluke. This was deliberate. She wasn't boasting. She wasn't looking around to see who noticed. She didn't even react when the spotter finally called it 3 for 3. Dead center grouping. Smallest spread of the round. Recruits blinked. Some stood frozen with rifles still at the ready. The noise, the usual banter, the ego-charged commentary, it all faded into a strange, unsettled quiet. Staff Sergeant Reynolds leaned forward slightly in his observation post, the corners of his mouth twitching, not quite a smile, but not a frown either. Just curiosity now sharpened into something else. Respect not yet, but the silence said what no one else could. They didn't see it coming. And suddenly Margaret Kane was no longer the background character. She was the one they were all watching. The weight of the rifle in her hands wasn't just steel and wood. It was memory. It was time. And as Margaret Kane sat back during the break between rounds, wiping dust from the stock with a small cloth folded neatly in her pocket, the noise around her faded again. Not into silence this time, but into memory. She remembered the Mekong first, the thick, wet air, the constant itch of sweat, the crack of gunfire that came not from in front, but from somewhere behind. Her first shot taken in combat wasn't clean, it wasn't glorious, but it saved a young private who'd frozen under fire. That private had written her a letter 2 years later, said he named his son after her. She never replied. Then there was Kuwait, Desert Storm. It wasn't the bullets that stayed with her, it was the sand. The endless, grinding sand that slipped into your boots, your weapon, your mind. There was a morning she fired 8 rounds through a cracked scope after her spotter had been hit. No tech, just wind instinct and anger she couldn't quite describe. When it was over, the dust settled on silence, and 7 lives were still intact because of her trigger finger. No medals for that, just quiet nods from men too proud to say what they really felt. She looked down at her hand now, the veins more prominent, the skin thinner than it once was. But the grip was still steady. These kids at Fort Archer didn't know her. They didn't need to. She wasn't here to prove anything. She wasn't chasing some fading glory or hoping someone would clap for her on the way out. She was here to see if the fire was still in her chest. Not the fire for war, God knew she'd had enough of that, but the fire for discipline, for focus, for the kind of deadly calm that separated a soldier from a civilian. This rifle range wasn't a battlefield, but it was still sacred ground. And Margaret Kane hadn't shown up to be admired. She showed up to make sure that if she had to lift a rifle again for a reason that mattered, her hands wouldn't hesitate. Not once. Not ever. By the time the recruits gathered at the 800-yard range, the desert wind had sharpened its edge. It came in low bursts, kicking up fine veils of sand that scraped against exposed skin and blurred the targets in a ghostly shimmer. The instructors gave the usual warnings: watch for crosswinds, compensate for drop, take your time, but everyone knew this trial separated show-offs from shooters. Most of the recruits were already tired, sunburned, and irritable, but no one admitted it. Not here. Not with scores on the line. One by one they took their shots, and one by one they missed. Some rounds sailed wide, others grazed the edge. A few recruits hit near the torso markers, but even those came with corrections barked from spotters. Too high left drift, pulling right. Frustration simmered. Even Harrison, the smug corporal with the mirrored sunglasses, had to take 3 attempts before finally landing one near center. He stood up, scowling at the wind like it was personal. Then it was Margaret Kane's turn. She walked to the mat slowly, deliberately. No show, no hesitation. The younger recruits had stopped laughing by now. Some folded their arms. Some just stared, waiting maybe for her to fumble, maybe for her to surprise them. Either way, they were watching. Margaret unfolded her worn shooting mat, lowered herself into position, and pulled the old bolt action rifle into her shoulder. She didn't have a spotter. She didn't need one. She just listened. The wind shifted. She closed her eyes for a second, feeling it move across her cheek. Then she opened her weathered notebook, scribbled a few adjustments, and locked in. First shot, crack, ping, direct hit. Second shot, ping, dead center. Third, fourth, fifth, ping, ping, ping. Every shot landed in a grouping so tight, the spotter had to check twice. All targets hit, he called out. 2-inch spread, cleanest grouping of the day. No one spoke, not even Harrison. Staff Sergeant Reynolds removed his sunglasses slowly. He looked not just surprised but disturbed, like something he thought he understood about the world had just shifted an inch. Margaret didn't gloat, didn't even glance at the others. She simply stood, dusted off her knees, and walked away like she'd just finished her morning coffee. But the effect rippled. Conversation stopped. Arms uncrossed, jaws clenched. Where there had once been mockery, now there was silence. The kind of silence that doesn't fall like a curtain, it rises like a truth. For the first time, Margaret Kane wasn't a joke. She wasn't even a question. She was the standard. And every man and woman on that range knew it. That night the wind died down. The desert quieted, but Staff Sergeant Reynolds couldn't shake the sound of the spotter's voice from earlier. 5 for 5? Tightest grouping yet. He'd heard good shooting before. Hell, he'd trained champions. But what Margaret Kane did on that range hadn't been just skill. It had been surgical, controlled, like muscle memory from a lifetime ago. So after the last recruit turned in and the mess hall lights dimmed, Reynolds stayed behind in the admin office, the flickering fluorescent bulb above him, buzzing like a mosquito trapped in time. He pulled out the base's old personnel database, something half the younger staff barely touched, and typed Kane, Margaret E. The screen loaded slowly. Then it hit him. First Sergeant U.S. Army, enlisted 1968, Vietnam War, 2 tours. Later reactivated for Operation Desert Storm. Decorated marksman 6-time expert qualification. Commendations for leadership under fire, Bronze Star, Purple Heart, and then a redacted block of text. Lines struck through with vague classifications. But one line remained. Unofficial kill count, unconfirmed, assumed high. Known to have extracted a pinned unit under direct enemy fire in the Al Jalib corridor, 1991. Reynolds blinked. He'd heard of that operation. Everyone had. A unit was surrounded for hours in open terrain, picked off one by one, until, as the legend went, a lone marksman eliminated 5 hostiles from nearly a kilometer away, saving the survivors. No one had ever named the shooter. Apparently, they hadn't needed to. He scrolled further. No disciplinary records, no misconduct. After retirement, she trained inner-city youth in firearms safety and marksmanship. Quiet, clean, purposeful. He leaned back, exhaling hard. All day he'd stood there, arms crossed, watching the others laugh at her, mock her, and he'd said nothing. Because like them, he thought she was chasing ghosts. But the truth was, she was the ghost. The kind that built the very foundation they stood on. She didn't need to prove herself. Not to them. Not to him. She already had decades ago under fire when it counted. And now she was back. Not for applause. Not for redemption. Just to be sure her hands hadn't forgotten what her heart had always known. Reynolds printed the file, slipped it into a manila folder, and stood slowly. He wasn't sure what he'd say to her. But he knew one thing. Tomorrow he'd be the one listening. The barracks had barely gone quiet when the alarm ripped through the base. A siren wailed, sharp, panicked. Then shouting. Boots hit the floors. Lights snapped on like muzzle flashes. Recruits scrambled into partial gear, instructors barked confused orders, and the radios buzzed with overlapping calls. Something had gone wrong badly. Staff Sergeant Reynolds was already halfway out the door when he caught the fragments over the comms live-round. Navigation drill, echo unit, 1 injured, 1 unaccounted for. The night drill had been a standard land nav exercise, no ammunition, just coordinates and teamwork. But somehow someone had ended up with a live round, and now a young recruit was bleeding and another gone. Panic simmered beneath protocol. No one had clear orders. Flashlights danced over the sand as instructors shouted over each other. That's when she stepped into the chaos. Margaret Kane, already in her jacket rifle slung over one shoulder, not as a weapon, but as part of her. She moved with none of the adrenaline-fueled panic of the younger men. Just focus. Reynolds spotted her approaching the scene. Kane, stay clear. This isn't, she cut him off with a look. Calm, unapologetic. You've got 6 rookies running in circles, 1 bleeding out, and another still out there in terrain. I know better than the back of my hand, she said. You want protocol or results? He hesitated for the briefest moment. Then he nodded. Take point. I'll follow. She was already moving. The East Ravine. That's where she said he'd be. And she was right. Years of war had etched maps into her bones. The terrain spoke to her like an old friend. She traced the boot prints, paused at broken brush, caught signs no one else noticed. Her thigh ached with every step, an old injury from Kuwait, but she didn't slow. 30 minutes into the search, just past a dried creek bed, she heard it, a rustle, a soft groan. She dropped to one knee and scanned the undergrowth. Colby, she called softly. A low voice came back. Ma'am, you came back. He was tangled in brambles, arm bent, at a sick angle, face pale. Of course I did, she murmured, crawling toward him. No one gets left behind. By the time Reynolds caught up, she had stabilized the boy's arm with her sling and was gently guiding him upright. Reynolds stared not at her gear or the rescue, but at her presence. He saw now what he hadn't before. Not an old veteran, a leader, one the battlefield had carved, not decorated. I was wrong about you, he admitted quietly. No, she said, helping Colby into his grip. You just hadn't heard the echoes yet. And in that quiet moment beneath the stars and swirling dust of Fort Archer, even Reynolds knew he'd follow Margaret Kane into any fire. The final trial at Fort Archer was infamous. Recruits whispered about it in the mess hall, trading second-hand horror stories, 5 moving targets, 600 yards unpredictable crosswinds. Miss two and you fail, simple as that. The phrase instructors used was always the same. This is where we separate the shooters from the statues. The targets glided across the field, mechanized silhouettes, rolling left to right, accelerating unpredictably. Some paused mid-track. Others disappeared behind scrub brush before reappearing like ghosts. Precision under pressure. That was the test. Harrison adjusted his bipod, muttering numbers under his breath. His rifle gleamed under the morning sun. Top-of-the-line optics rangefinder tech, everything the modern army could offer. He fired fast, too fast. He clipped two, missed three. The spotter called out Harrison. Two confirmed hits. Provisional pass. He scoffed as if the machine had made a mistake. Whatever, he mumbled, brushing dust off his knee. Then came the name no one expected to hear again. Kane, on the line. The recruits fell into a hush. Margaret stepped forward slowly, her old boots pressing into the dry earth, like they remembered how the ground used to feel before pride got in the way. She knelt beside her battered rifle and unfolded her mat with the same reverence she might give a flag. No recalibrations, no muttered math, just muscle memory. She lay prone, her cheek resting against the worn stock, the initials M. Kane faintly visible in the wood. The breeze kicked up sand across the range. A sheet of it rolled sideways, clouding vision for most, but not for her. The first target rolled into view. Crack, hit, second, crack, hit, third, crack, confirmed, fourth, crack, center mass, fifth. The wind surged. The target zigzagged. She didn't blink. Crack. The field went still. Final target, hit. All targets down. Tightest grouping on record. No one breathed. Even Harrison stood frozen, his smirk long gone. Reynolds didn't clap. He didn't need to. Instead, he stepped forward slowly, voice even but waited. That is what excellence looks like. Quiet, precise, earned. Margaret stood brushing the dust from her knees like she had done it 100 times before. She gave a small nod not to herself, but to the ghost she'd carried into this desert with her. She didn't smile, but her silence roared louder than any applause ever could. And across that range, from the lowest private to the highest instructor, every single person understood. They hadn't just witnessed skill. They had witnessed legacy carved not in ceremony, but in crosshairs. The mess hall at Fort Archer usually buzzed with noise forks clattering against trays, boots scuffing across tile, laughter rolling down the aisles in waves. But not that day, not after what they'd seen. Margaret Kane sat in her usual spot, back corner, nearest the window where the sun hit the wall just right. Same tray, same posture, elbows and back straight, eating like someone who had done it alone for years. Only this time the silence around her wasn't isolation, it was reverence. No one laughed. No one mimicked her limp. No one joked about bingo or knitting needles. Across the room, Harrison sat hunched over his coffee, staring at his tray, like it might answer the questions running through his head. He hadn't spoken since the test. Not really. Not to anyone. Finally, he stood. His boots echoed louder than usual as he crossed the hall. Recruits glanced up from their food forks, frozen midair. Even Reynolds, watching from the far side of the room, leaned slightly forward. Harrison stopped in front of her table. She didn't look up. He cleared his throat. Then again. Sergeant Kane, he said, voice lower than anyone had ever heard it. I was wrong. She paused mid-bite, then set her fork down gently. About all of it, he added, hands twitching at his sides. About you. Yeah, I'll remember that shot for the rest of my life. Only then did she meet his eyes. A small, tired nod. That was all. But it wasn't small to him. And just like that, he turned and walked away back into the sea of silence. Moments later, two younger recruits approached her table, Vega and Juno. Both had mocked her earlier in the week. Now they stood awkwardly, eyes cast downward, holding their trays like schoolboys unsure of where to sit. Mind if we ask you something, Juno said. About the wind drift adjustment. Margaret glanced at the empty seats across from her. Then she shifted her tray, slightly clearing space. They sat, not as equals, as students. For the next 20 minutes, they asked not about weapons, not just about rifles, but about calm, about timing, about how to know when to pull the trigger. She answered in fragments, short clipped sentences. Enough to teach, not enough to preach. When her tray was empty, Margaret stood quietly, slung her rifle case over her shoulder, and walked toward the exit. No fanfare, no applause, but every head turned as she passed. And long after she stepped out into the sunlit dust of Fort Archer, the shadow she left behind remained. Not heavy, not haunting, but grounding like the presence of something ancient and steady that refuses to be forgotten. Because at Fort Archer from that day on, respect wasn't given with rank. It was earned in silence. True warriors don't shout. They don't pound their chests or demand to be seen. They don't chase glory or remind you of medals once pinned to a younger uniform. They just show up. They aim once, breathe slow, and let the silence speak for them. Margaret Kane never raised her voice, not once, but the silence she left behind at Fort Archer echoed louder than any speech. She walked in as a stranger, dismissed, doubted, judged, before she'd even touched the rifle. And yet, without asking for permission, without demanding attention, she rewrote the tone of that entire base. Not through confrontation, but through execution, through focus, through discipline that ran deeper than age, and a presence forged not in training manuals, but in live combat, real sacrifice, and decades of living with what others never return from. She didn't lecture. She didn't gloat. She simply did the work quietly, methodically, shot after shot, step after step. And that's the kind of leadership the world forgets to value. It's not loud. It's not polished for social media. It doesn't wear swagger like a badge, but it endures. Because dignity doesn't require validation. Legacy doesn't ask for a spotlight. And real warriors, they lead even when no one's watching, and especially when no one believes in them. By the end of her time at Fort Archer, Margaret Kane hadn't just qualified. She hadn't just passed a test. She'd reminded a new generation of soldiers that skill isn't always young, and strength doesn't always shout. She'd left a trail for someone else to follow a young woman maybe arriving next month. A recruit just like Margaret once was trying to find her place in a world built to test her, and maybe that recruit won't be laughed at quite so quickly. Maybe someone will remember the quiet older woman with the faded rifle case, the slow gait, and the deadliest shot Fort Archer had ever seen. Maybe they'll pause, hold judgment, listen, because silence when it comes from someone who has walked through fire and come out stronger isn't weakness, it's wisdom. And wisdom, like legacy, never leaves loudly. It just stands still long enough for others to aim a little straighter and breathe. Margaret Kane's story isn't just about a rifle range or a forgotten veteran. It's a reflection of something deeper, something many of us recognize in our own lives. How many times have we judged someone by appearance? How often have we dismissed the quiet ones, the older worker, the woman with the cane, the man who doesn't speak much but shows up every single day? In today's world where noise often drowns out truth, Margaret reminds us of something sacred. Real strength is quiet. Real dignity doesn't need an audience. This isn't just a military story. It's about respect, something we owe not just to our veterans, but to the people in our own families, our neighborhoods, even the strangers we pass by every day. And maybe that's the question I'd like to leave with you. Who is the Margaret Kane in your life? The person quietly holding everything together while the world walks right past them? Have you thanked them? Have you noticed them? I'd love for you to share that in the comments. Tell us about someone who reminds you of Margaret, or share a time when you were underestimated and prove them wrong without saying a word. Your stories matter, and so does your voice. If this story moved you, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear it today, especially someone who might feel invisible. Because sometimes all it takes is one story to remind us that silence is not weakness. It's where wisdom waits. Thanks for spending this time with me. I'll see you in the next one.